Hello. Given it's the Easter break, thought it might make sense to share a little artifact that I've created. It's a checklist of things to think about when writing product requirements. Um, Now, obviously, this is skewed towards my most recent stint, and it's probably something that I should have done in hindsight from the start of my career, so as to have an exhaustive checklist of things to think through whenever one writes a requirement. But better late than never, I guess. I was going to quickly go through this list and see if some of this is relevant to any of the people that see this video, and also at the end open up this link to everyone who would like to contribute to this list. So I'm sure it'll be a useful asset to anyone who's in this space. So let's kick it off. Um, One of the initial things that I generally consider is PII, PCI implications. So this is more so around. So let's say if you are if in your UIs you have data that is being input that is sensitive in nature, would this data need to be masked? Would the data need to be stored in encrypted fields? Things like that. So if your requirement touches on those things, that's one point to consider. In a similar vein, how would different user roles? So if you work for a large organization that does multiple products, and these products need to be administered, how would you separate your administrative users from your actual end users, your actual consumers of your product, when they look at requirements, when they look at your UI, for example, if you'd want to prevent your staff users from viewing your end user data, you can look at things like masking or permission diffs to create that separation. Once again, similarly, uh, how would you as a product or as staff who manage a product, how would you administer a tool? So it's it's a good hack to have an administrative view so that you can not just we'll talk a little bit about feature flags as well. It helps you control things going out into production, but also like certain other things, like certain administrative parameters, time zones, language, all of those things can be considered in an administrative view. So if you do have an administrative view, does your requirement cater just not just the end user view, but also to an administrative view? And when rolling out a requirement, once it's rolled out, how would you keep an eye on how this requirement is being used? So if you use observability tools like Heap, Hotjar, or you have like a BI database, for example, does your requirement cover certain things? So more often than not, you know, you wouldn't really need to call this out explicitly. Observability, an engineering team would build to it implicitly, but it doesn't hurt to think about. So if there are, if for example in Heap, if you need a custom variable implemented, you would obviously have to engage with the engineering team to get that sorted out. So observability is another angle to think about when thinking about requirements. Auditability. This is something that I think we as a team did very well in a previous stint. When rolling out a whole product out into market, it was a complete revamp. We built a self auditability functionality where the users could self-serve and look at their own audit logs and to see which users perform which action on the product. So and yeah, we persisted data in a point in time manner that was very useful, not just for us who were maintaining the system and rolling out the system, but also for the end users. So auditability, we dedicated a whole epic and I think a sprint to build that functionality out, but it proved quite useful towards the end. So whenever we're writing a requirement, it might be worthwhile thinking, hey, should we build certain auditability functionality that accompanies this particular requirement. And yeah, so once again, sticking with the theme of observability, if you use BI databases to see how customers enable disable functionality, what values they input, yeah, it might be worth talking to your engineering team to get those fields that are being pushed into your BI databases. It's just a thing, more often than not, in the rush to push things out, get things out in a timely manner into production, some of these things might be overlooked. But obviously, a very mature engineering team would automatically push the relevant fields into BI database as well. But it's good to have this as a checklist item. Yeah, and this goes without saying. Whenever you write a requirement, it should never be done in isolation. You should always consult with your design team, your QA, and most importantly, in terms of engineering feasibility. As an example, given a particular, you work in a constrained environment. So, given a certain timeline, would having an open socket be feasible versus a simple refresh button on the UI? So, technical feasibility in conjunction with timelines, it's always important to get your ACs run through with your engineering team. But that's part of your progressive elaboration, anyways. How would we test this functionality? Well, this is more so of a QA lens. So not every requirement that you write, like we write requirements as POs, as BAs, as PMs even, write requirements with a customer lens. But from a testing lens, after you've decomposed that into simpler stories, into simpler ACs, testing a particular AC wouldn't necessarily manifest on the UI. It could be something as simple as seeing a certain string in a log. So it's important to think of, hey, if we've broken this down into a very unitary requirement, how do we really test it? That's the reason why I have put this in here. So it's not necessarily something that will be tested on the UI. Moving on, how does the release of this? This is more so organizational. So if you work in an environment where you've got supporting team members, supporting colleagues, it's always important to make sure that they are informed in advance and they're sufficiently enabled to continue supporting the functionality that gets pushed out into production. Uh, yeah, and then if your organization maintains a knowledge base, FAQs, how-to articles, uh, with as a result of rolling out this functionality, have you made sure, as a product person, have you updated the knowledge base? And once again, similar vein, this is all part and parcel of product marketing. So this is a more product marketing lens. So if you are writing a requirement that once it gets rolled out, if the rolling out of this requirement requires application downtime, do we need to preemptively communicate this to the users? How will that be communicated? Would it be within the app itself, or would you need to send comms separately in the form of email? So it's a very important thing to think about when writing requirements. So, I mean, that obviously influences your estimates as well. So if downtime is required, got to put things like banners within the app or downtime pages. All of those things are important things to think about. Uh, this is probably going back in time. Um, so back in the days when before stories, we used to write use cases. And then, we used to always think of the actor, preconditions, postconditions, what the happy path was, what the exclusion, what the alternate path was, and what the exemption path was. So I find that what really helps me is to have a Figma file of all of the flows and all of the paths mapped out. I find that much more useful than having a working prototype because I don't think that gives me personally, as a product person, a bird's eye view of all of the paths that a particular user would go through. Yeah. that's a quick spiel. So it's worth bringing back all of these alternate paths, the exclusion path, and then the happy path, obviously. And have you handled, like, have you done error handling for each of these scenarios? A good thing to think about is by when you're writing a requirement is, would the implementation of this requirement regress existing requirements that are already implemented? So I can quote an example without being too specific. Like recently, we were working on a requirement, but there was already a compliance requirement that was at play, and then we had to reconcile the new requirement with the old existing requirement so that they could both coexist. So yeah, regression is something that in terms of requirements, is something that a good product person always needs to think about. Um, I touched on this earlier. I think feature toggles. People talk about launch darkly and all of these cool tools. It's not really necessary if you have an administrative view of your product. You can have your own feature toggles and save on the cost, I guess. But if your feature is large or important enough to have its own feature toggle, it helps, I guess, an engineering team to build behind it. And then, if and only if you're ready, you could switch it on. And you could also do release management by virtue of having this feature toggle, so you can switch it on only for certain geos if that's how you want to roll it out. Yeah, or individually to individual customers if that's how the feature is intended to be rolled out. It's also good to think about how release is going to happen. So some requirements are large enough to have a lot of dependencies, a lot of teams, components working together. And when it gets eventually pushed out into production, it's worthwhile thinking about, hey, should we pilot and learn about how our customers are using this feature and then make iterative improvements on it before we roll it out big bang? And even if you're going to roll it out big bang, would you like to do little cohorts so that it's a lot more manageable to your infrastructure and even to your team, in terms of getting feedback and handling things, especially if it's a large feature that you're pushing out into production. Yeah, and then once again, this is more so a content team lens. So once your requirements ready to be vetted, you could hand it over. And obviously this differs from organization to organization. More often than not, it's the product person that does a copy review, just to make sure that little things like formal tone, succinctiveness, whether it's not very verbose, and you've had inclusive language across your UI, across your workflows. And then in a similar vein, are there any localization or translation requirements that you need to think of whenever you roll out a particular requirement? So yep. And sorry, I'm segueing back into release. So when pushing something out into production, it might be worthwhile, as someone who is writing a requirement, to think: is this something for which we need to have contingencies in terms of rolling back, or is this something that we want to fail and move forward? Once again, the scale of things are, if the requirement is quite a large requirement, it just changes. So this is obviously a discussion that you'd have to have as a team before before deciding on which option that you'd go for, and it's very context dependent. But something that I'd like to think about. So yeah, if you have the risk appetite for it, something I prefer to just fail forward rather than thinking of rolling back. Yes, and once again, like I mentioned, as an engineering team, observability is not something that, as a product person, you need to write explicitly, but it helps that you think about alerting, logging, monitoring whenever you write product requirements. Any other compliance requirements? This is more so around the UI. Like if you have, are there compliance requirements that you need to see to whenever you push out a requirement into production? Once again, this touches on the alternate paths and the exception path. So when doing so, have all of the empty loading error states been considered? I think it's quite interesting when you're working, let's say, for example, with an integration. So it's very important to think of, hey, what if an API is down? Do we need to design an error message for this and an error state for this? Or for example, if it's an intensive process, a fairly intensive process, have you thought of a loading UI UX? And if it's a first time user, I think it's quite important to think of an empty state as well. Yeah, and then have we considered the implication of, oh yeah, so thinking of downstream and upstream systems. So more often than not, a product doesn't live in a vacuum. It interacts with multiple upstream and downstream systems. I think as a good product person when writing requirements, it's very important to consider the chain of information from upstream systems to your product, fulfilling the requirement, and then going all the way down to downstream systems as well. Um, yeah, it's a good mental check to have after you've written a requirement. Think, hey, are there any dependencies on other systems? Um, Once again, this is org specific. If the product is being sold actively, if you're in a sales led organization, have you sufficiently enabled your sales colleagues by giving them, for example, a separate environment for them to sell, or have you given them enough collateral? So once again, this is more so at an epic level or feature level as opposed to individual story or AC level, but something to think about. Uh, yeah. Another important thing is if you're working on a fairly intense, or like an intensely used functionality, would implementing your requirement, degrade performance for existing users? So would you need to run a profile before a particular requirement is to be released? Once again, an engineering team would be the first to put their hands up and tell you, hey, look, this is fairly intensive. Implementing this requirement would impact performance, but as a good product person, it's good to have this in your radar. Yeah. Once again, based on your product, if you're offering it in multiple platforms, so web, mobile, something that I notice is, I tend to generally focus predominantly on the web app. So it takes a bit of the time for me to, bring in the mobile flows into consideration. Depending on the place where you work, your organization structure, you might have these as two separate teams. But once again, when writing it, it's always important to think of all of the platforms that your product is offered on. And the last thing that I have here on this list is if you're working with an API spec or an XSD, something that I've personally found is there are requirements that are nested in there. And it's worthwhile as a product person to to just skim through these documents to understand certain validations that are in there, and then how fulfilling some of these validations can be done on the UI, can be done as part of your UX itself. These were all the things that I had. Now, like I mentioned, this is just a recent memory jot down of all of the things that of this checklist. Ideally, I should have done this, at the start of my career. But I think how I can remedy for it is by opening this up to a larger community. I'll share this as editable for everyone. So if anyone has any other things that should be on this checklist of writing good product requirements, please feel free to add on to this. Thank you.